to congratulate you. The continuation of Osten Art is fantastic. Number one, I devoured every single book, and I'm now re-listening to the Audible audiobooks. I cannot wait for November, to be honest.
Thank you.
My question is, because I've been a fan for quite some time.
Ever since I was 6, right? Remember that. That's our time. That's our timeline, and I'm going to defend it. Okay.
Exactly. I also read Shadow March, which I love dearly too. And what I noticed is you have a thing for very strong female characters. So where does that come from?
I have been surrounded by them most of my life, to be quite honest with you. My mom, who just died about a year and a half ago, no, less than, anyway, getting close to 2 years now, and she's actually, the Dragonbone chair is dedicated to her, because she was a very strong character, and she was sort of the matriarch of the family, but she was also somebody who loved words and books and games and nonsense and singing ridiculous songs, to her kids and things like that. And I could not possibly divide myself from her influence. She's probably the single greatest influence on who I became as a writer or whatever. The things that she introduced me to, she read to me when I was young, to my brothers as well. I mean, I was not the only one she read to, but I was the oldest, so I got all of this stuff first. And I was also, it was just her and me for the first 3 years before she met my stepdad, and they got married and then had 2 more sons. So she's very important to me. Obviously, the woman sitting next to you right there is another strong woman, almost terrifyingly so sometimes. That's my wife I'm referring to. I'm not just picking people out and saying weird things about them. My friend Ylva, another toughie here. I have all my life been, and both of my grandmothers as well, that I was fortunate enough to know and spend time with. So I've been surrounded by, I don't even think of them as strong women. I mean, that never even occurred to me at the time. As far as I was concerned, there were women, there were men, and they both were whatever they were. And sometimes people have asked me and said, well, how do you write women characters? Usually I hope they're saying it in a complimentary, they're asking in a complimentary way. And I always say, well, first of all, I don't write women characters. I write male characters and female characters as characters. And every single one of them is different. And obviously, in imaginary worlds and real worlds, men and women, and obviously non-binary people have different experiences. So, I'm not claiming they're all the same, but people are more individual than they are a gender or anything like that, except when we're making jokes where it's easy, you just want to jump to the generalizations, But so I have never ever sat down and thought, okay, I need a character who acts like a female. I can't, I can't imagine what acts like a female is any more than I can imagine it with acts like a male, acts like a Belgian, acts like an anteater. I just don't know. So all credit has to go with the fact that I have spent most of my life surrounded by people who happen to be female, who were very strong, smart, people who took care of business and had things to say, and I learned from. And I can't really take a lot of credit for it. I didn't invent this background. It's what I was lucky enough to grow up with.
Well, you were way, way ahead of time. Other than 2.
If so, I'm pleased to hear that. As I said, I don't set out. Well, that's actually Otherland is a good example. I didn't set out with any of those characters and go, oh, she's a woman and she's African, therefore I have to think of her as, that was part of her character, of Renee I'm talking about. That was part of Renee's character, but it wasn't the whole of her character that she was African, and it wasn't the whole of her character that she was female. And that's one of the ways that fiction and literature It crosses boundaries because it's not just about a tired rehearsal of old cliches. It's about trying to get to the root of the humanness that is in all of us, and that makes us both so much the same and so different, every one of us.
Tell that Hollywood.
Yeah. Well,
about stereotypes.
I know.
But still, I mean, in other land, you wrote characters that were so diverse. Before anybody talked about diversity in any field. I mean, you had a really sick young man dying of a weird disease. You had a lesbian police woman.
Can I tell a quick story? Should I tell a quick story? For those of you who've read Otherland, you'll get this. If not, you can kind of read between the lines. One of the best emails, I think it was an actual letter, back when people still did those. One of the best letters I ever got was from somebody who said, I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy and other kinds of fiction. I don't expect to ever find anybody who's very much like me in the things I read. She said, but since I am a Greco-Australian lesbian police detective, yes, I found myself somewhat in sympathy with your Greco-Australian lesbian police detective. So yeah, no, that was one of my. I just thought that was hilarious.
Oh, that's
you remember
awesome.
that? That was so fun.
And before we get to the next question, did everybody understand her question, or shall we repeat? No complaints? Okay, then.
If anybody can't hear, please just let us know and we'll repeat the questions.
Your turn. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You've created quite an impressive amount of cultures and languages in your books. And I was wondering, how do you go about expanding them? So do you just wing it, or how do you deal with linguistic consistency? I just think it's fascinating.
Well, I will start off by saying I am no Tolkien. Okay, I mean, J.R.R. Tolkien first of all, he was a professional philologist. Second of all, he spent his entire life working on the various Elven languages and sub-languages. Thirdly, he did that before he wrote the books. That was essentially an excuse to use the languages, which, this book that we've all read and, been moved by. No, it was just him, trying to find a way to use all that Quenya he'd been working on. I am nowhere near like that. I do really enjoy languages, which is one of the reasons I'm so ashamed that I am speaking English to you all and you are having to speak English to me. I will get back to learning German again, I promise. I do have a couple of other languages I can speak. I like languages. But I do not, first of all, because I've written so many damn books with so many different, situations and locales, I do not have the skill to actually construct real languages. Plus, in a lot of cases, and the Ostenard books are a very good example of this, I am not necessarily trying to tell the readers that a given language or a given culture is what it seems to be because of what we recognize that's similar to the real world. So for instance, in the Ostenard books, yes, there is a definite Celtic/Gaelic tone to a lot of the culture of the Hernistiri. Same thing with the Rimmersmen are, there's a lot of Icelandic in them and things like that. Now that's not meant to say that's who those are or the distinction is that firm. It was more, I realized when I started writing The Dragonbone Chair and started to see how many characters I was going to have and how many plot lines that I want to give the readers handholds, something to grab onto so that if they saw a name and the character was named Isbjorn or something like that, they'd go, oh, that sounds Scandinavian. They must be the Rimmersgarders. So I didn't mean for those people to be Icelanders. I meant for them to be identifiable as a group. And so I picked something close. Now that said, I do then use those languages as a bit of a jumping off point. I use real languages. I use Irish Gaelic as a jumping off point for the Hernistiri, Icelandic as mentioned. My my much deeper knowledge of Latinate or Romance languages for the Nabani and various others. There's obviously within Erkenland, there's an Anglo-Saxon Old English thing, and in fact the Thrivings folk originally were part of the same group as the Erkenlanders, so if you look, the Thrivings names and bits of language are actually, like German and English, they are languages that have gone through some consonant shifts and things like that, so they're very much related. These are mostly meant to give people who know a little bit of these languages kind of a, oh, that character's name means eagle, or that place is named High Stone House, or something like that. As far as the closer to being made up languages like the Scythi, I took some general sounds that were meant to sound more Asian as a contrast to the European beginning, the Eurocentric beginnings of the Dragonbone chair. Because again, my idea was not, I want these characters to be semi-Japanese. No, the idea was that I want the reader to go from the more familiar to the less familiar, just as the characters do, just as Simon does. He goes out into the world and moves farther and farther away from not just the culture, but the tales and the truths he thinks are truths of his culture, and finds out it's a bigger world out there. So again, not making up any languages, using languages where I can, messing with them a bit, and then the part that becomes important is then you have to be consistent to what you've already done. And that sucks. I just wanted to say that. That's really, I have to go back every time and reread, all the other times I've used the language and make sure my glossary is up to date and all that stuff. But, so, does that answer?
Yes,
Okay, good.
Interesting to hear that you care about your glossary. I thought that was my part.
Well, thank God now somebody else is helping me out with the glossary. That's more important than you know. Because I'm tired, Ylva, and I'm 46 now.
Yeah.
Hi. On my way here, I started to reread The Heart of Lost Things, and a few weeks ago I listened to a podcast from the guys Restless History, who made a podcast about Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and General Custer, the stuff. How much has American history influenced your conception of the relationships between the people?
It's a very good question. And does everybody hear the question? American history. How did American history, things like Custer, Little Bighorn, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, how did that stuff? The reason it's an interesting question is because in some ways that is a deeper part for me. It's water that I swim in that I don't always recognize as the surrounding medium. However, I did grow up in a time when people in America in a much larger way were really questioning U.S. imperialism. They were beginning to look back, basically the 60s, they were beginning to look back on the history of America as an entity, both imaginary and real, what we taught ourselves we were, but what we actually did, and not just to the Native Americans, obviously, but to the slaves and early immigrants and the Chinese people who were brought in to build the railroads and then largely thrown back out again and, completely made unimportant and invisible in those who managed to stay, and were also discriminated against, of course. And I am not one of those people who says, oh, my country is the worst, everybody else is okay, but we're really bad. No, pretty much every Western country has vast meadows of shame to wander through. That is the very nature. Now, that does not mean we have to be paralyzed by that, but by God, we need to be aware of it. We need to understand what has given us the wealth and the power that we have, and much of it has been that people have been dispossessed, that whole classes have been held down, everything. It's just part of how things work. And again, I'm not singling out anything or anybody for blame. It's all of us. This is how we live.
No,
So, yeah.
I was more interested in the percolating of this process. I understood that you didn't do it by conscience. Say, okay, I'm writing an allegorical story about American history set in Austen art. Not
Yeah.
like that. But while reading, I thought, well, although it's constructed about medieval times, you have medieval first, you have European,
Yeah.
pseudo-European languages. I think, well, I don't think a European would have written that.
I can't say, obviously, since I've only sort of been semi-European for a few years when I was living in England, and we all know how only semi-European England is these days. But what I'm saying is that it's harder for me to separate out because it is so much a part of who I am. I was raised by liberal parents during the Vietnam War, during all of the 60s and the reconsideration of all these things. Obviously, anybody who has the kind of upbringing and sentiments that I have is full of feelings about, all of this stuff. And it's definitely seeped into my work. There's no question about that. But I have trouble separating it out because it's stuff that started in me, when I was 5 or 6 years old, when I saw, what was going on in the streets of Selma. Saw black people being attacked by Dobermans and hosed down and developing what became the political outlook I have on the world. But it started really early, whereas my fascination with European history and other parts of the world started later and was more intentional, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely, as a matter of fact, one of the other nice comments I had once was a young woman came to me and said, I really see, she was Native American by heritage, and she said, I really see my culture in the Scythi culture. And of course I was really pleased by that. Any writer is pleased when somebody finds a way into their work that makes it speak to them personally as a reader. But I did not set out to do that. And in fact, I would say most of these things are things that would be true no matter what the setting was because that's what I feel and it becomes part of my work. But I would suspect if you go through all of my work, you will see similar kinds of sentiments and similar kinds of... I try not to hammer people on the head with my politics, but I am who I am. And any writer worth her or his salt is writing from themselves from inside. They are putting out who they are through the medium. So, it's probably in all of my work. And yes, I did grow up. Deborah and I went to the battlefield at Little Bighorn, which is where, of course, General Custer got what he deserved. And, where the Native Americans won one of their few victories. And it is the most haunting place you have ever seen. And it's not just the fact that a bunch of soldiers and some Native Americans died there, although that is part of it. It is the whole futility of what happened between the Europeanized Americans moving west and the people who had been there for probably 20,000 years who were being slowly dispossessed. The whole site is not just about that particular battle, but the tragedy of how two groups of people can just, have that kind of a terrible, terrible interaction where it changes the world forever. So it's definitely in there, but I have trouble picking out specific bits. But yes, the Scythian and that kind of stuff, yes, they are in some ways the indigenous folk, although, last thing here, they themselves, they don't always know the truth or they don't always tell the truth about their own upbringing. So like any indigenous group anywhere, they are not, the old-fashioned idea of the noble savage, who are like kind of like dogs, they're lovely and kind and they're better than us. It's like, no, they're people. We have been the people that we are now, probably since before we were Homo sapiens, back to Australopithecines. Most of our characteristics were already starting to form up then. So nobody is perfectly innocent and nobody is perfectly guilty. But it's there. It's all there. So, other questions?
we might have time for a last one. There you go.
Coming back to your wonderful story about how you decided to going back to Ostner art, I'm just wondering, when you make the decision, did you already have some sort of finished idea in mind how the story would go, or is it something that is a progress that comes step by step and you only know how the story will end when you wrote the last side?
Well, I have talked about this before. Some of you will have heard George R.R. Martin's quip, I guess, for lack of a better term, about writers fitting into generally two camps. And one is architects, and the others is pantsers, which comes from the expression of flying by the seat of your pants or whatever, meaning you just make it up as you go. I have always been more of an architect, but I find for me it is important to try to keep that seat of the pants aspect in there as well. So when I am and I have to at least have an inkling of what's going to happen at the ending, because unlike a lot of writers, my work is not usually contained in a single volume, where when I get to the ending I can go, okay, now I'll go back and fix all the stuff that didn't agree with this ending, so that it all matches. No, by the time that I have gotten to the last volume, many of the earlier volumes have been published already. And as I always say, then my only alternative at that point, if I realize I've done something tragically wrong, is to go door to door with a felt pen and say, can I have your copy of Stone of Farewell there? And here, see where it says dead? Okay, we're just going to cross that out and put breathing very shallowly. And so I have to kind of walk what I think of as almost like a tight wire, like in the circus. I'm balancing, because on the one hand, I have to know enough about what's going to happen during the story that I can treat it like a single volume novel. And even in the early parts, I can put in clues and start little puzzles and begin things that are going to pay off way down the line. In this case, it was like 10 years down the line. But at the same time, first of all, if anybody would know if they'd ever seen one of my outlines, you cannot figure it out at the beginning entirely. You cannot. It's too complicated. You have no idea what's going to happen along the way. And when you try to, which you have to with an outline because that's what the publishers need to get money for you, it's boring as hell because you're just grabbing cliches to settle certain things. And then this happens, and then this happens. But the actual thing I try to do, and I kind of envision it like it's a misty landscape of hills. And the mist is high enough that I only see the tops of the hills. And so I say, okay, I want to get to that hill, then that hill, then that hill. And I know what those hilltops represent. But I have no idea what's going to happen in between the hilltops. And that's where the seat of the pants part comes in. That's where the characters that I wasn't expecting pop up and make themselves part of the story. Or that's where the little incidents that are just something that makes me happy, that I stick in there and the readers probably look at it and go, what was that? But that's where I'm making things up as I'm going. And occasionally, because of the things that happen down there in the foggy valleys, all of a sudden I go, oh, I guess I'm not going to that hill. I'm going to that hill, and that means I'll then have to go to that hill. So big changes can happen. And my outlines are only dimly connected to the final product. I never look at them again. I swear to God, I'm sure that there are many things that did happen as I wrote them in the outline, but there are many more that did not, because they were just, a kind of a placeholder, a bookmark for me at the beginning. So if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, so thank you all for attending. That was the reading. Now whoever likes might come up and get their book signed.
We will. And thank you.